In the scorching summer of 1943, amidst the dust and heat of the Mediterranean, the British High Command held a singular, unshakable belief. The United States Army was a collection of well-equipped amateurs. They were viewed as useful for their industrial might and for protecting supply lines, but they were not considered capable of winning complex battles against the hardened Wehrmacht. This condescension wasn't just a casual opinion, it was the foundation of Allied strategy. General Bernard Montgomery's plan to sideline the Americans during the invasion of Sicily was supposed to be the final word on the matter, a strategic maneuver designed to keep the amateurs out of the way while the professionals handled the war. It was a solid plan, approved by the highest levels of command, until George S. Patton decided to break every rule in the book. August 17, 1943. The air over Messina was thick with the smell of salt, cordite, and exhaust fumes. On the morning of the 17th, the silence of the city was broken not by British tracks, but by the boots of Lieutenant Colonel Lyle Bernard's 3rd Battalion, 15th Infantry Regiment. These American soldiers, dusty, exhausted, and battle-hardened, entered Messina, Sicily, with a wariness that soon turned to triumph. They took control of the port facilities, the municipal buildings, and the strategic intersections. Above the city, snapping in the hot wind, American flags went up, claiming the sky. Hours later, at precisely 10:30 a.m., the sound of bagpipes and the rumble of British armor signaled the arrival of a patrol from Montgomery's 8th Army. They rolled into the city, expecting to claim the prize, the culmination of a grueling campaign. Instead, they found the Americans already in position. The race was over. The British general, who was preordained to win the hero of El Alamein, had lost. And he hadn't just lost to the Germans or the terrain. He had lost to the American general he had tried to park on the sidelines. They didn't just find the city occupied. They found the amateurs leaning against the crumbling walls, smoking cigarettes, holding the keys to the city, and wearing grins that said more than any speech could. The profound silence of that British patrol spoke louder than any victory parade. This wasn't merely a case of two egotistical commanders competing for headlines in the morning papers. This was a seismic shift in the geopolitical landscape. This was the moment the United States Army proved, definitively and violently, that it was no longer Britain's junior partner. This was when American soldiers showed the world they weren't students learning from their betters, but warriors capable of outpacing them. This was the 72-hour impossible drive that changed everything. To understand the magnitude of this moment, one must understand the operation itself. Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. It was the first major Allied assault on Axis territory in Europe, a massive amphibious undertaking that dwarfed previous operations. It was the dress rehearsal for everything that would follow, including D-Day. The plan was developed by a coalition of British and American planners, working under General Harold Alexander, who commanded the 15th Army Group. However, coalition was a generous term. Alexander was British, deeply experienced, and believed strongly in the doctrine of giving Montgomery whatever he required. Of the 161 staff officers at his headquarters, a mere 12 were American. The planning was, in every sense, a British show. This wasn't a meeting of equal allies. It was a room full of stern teachers who didn't think their unruly students would ever graduate. To the British establishment, the Americans weren't partners to be trusted with the spearhead. They were a glorified guardrail designed to facilitate Montgomery's glory. The operational plan was crafted to give Montgomery the starring role. His British 8th Army, seasoned veterans of the North African campaign, would land on Sicily's southeastern beaches. Their mission was to advance up the eastern coast along the main highway, Route 114. Their objective, Messina, the critical port city at Sicily's northeastern tip. Capture Messina, and you controlled the exit to Italy. You effectively uncorked the bottle and trapped the German forces on the island. Montgomery's route was direct, logical, and favored by geography. It offered good roads and coastal terrain that allowed for naval support. It was the shortest path from the landing beaches to the objective. In the minds of the planners, this was where the decisive battles would be fought and won by the Empire. Patton's American 7th Army received a fundamentally different mission. They were to land west of the British beaches, centering on Gela and Licata, and their primary directive was to protect Montgomery's left flank. It was a supporting role, security duty. Their job was to ensure no Germans attacked Montgomery's forces from the west, while the British did the heavy lifting advancing north. The plan was built on the assumption that Montgomery would face the strongest German resistance, which was true, but it also assumed that only his 8th Army had the experience to handle such tough fighting. The Americans were there to guard the flank and, theoretically, learn by watching the professionals work. Montgomery's planning documents were meticulous, estimating a campaign duration of 6 to 8 weeks to reach Messina. The strategy relied on careful preparation at each phase: build up overwhelming force, stockpile supplies, and then attack. It was designed to minimize casualties through a methodical, grinding advance. No unnecessary risks, no wild gambles. It was textbook Montgomery, the same set-piece battle approach that had crushed Rommel at El Alamein. Slow, cautious, professional. But when Patton saw the plan, he understood exactly what was happening beneath the surface. The British were carving out the glory mission for themselves while parking the Americans in a subordinate, passive role. Montgomery would capture Messina and claim credit for taking Sicily, reinforcing the narrative that Britain was the brain and sword of the alliance, while America was merely the shield. Patton had just spent agonizing months rebuilding American credibility after the disaster at Kasserine Pass in North Africa, where American troops had been routed. He carried the weight of that humiliation. He wasn't going to let Montgomery turn Sicily into a British showcase that reinforced the narrative of American inferiority. But the plan was set in stone. Alexander had approved it. The landing dates were fixed. Patton would have to execute his assigned mission. Unless, of course, he found a way to change the mission on the fly. The catalyst for conflict was Route 124, the Vizini-Caltagirone Road. This was the main highway running north through the center of the island, flanking the eastern coast from the landing beaches toward Messina. It was the best road on the island, direct, well-maintained, and built for moving armies quickly. The original planning documents assigned this road to be shared, or at least available, to American forces to assist in the push. It was wide enough for multiple divisions to advance simultaneously. Both armies could use it to push north together, creating a dual-pronged hammer. Then, in a move that infuriated the Americans, Montgomery changed the plan. He claimed operational necessity required giving Route 124 exclusively to the British 8th Army. American forces would have to find alternative routes to the west treacherous mountain tracks that barely qualified as roads. The justification was logistics and traffic control. Montgomery argued that having two armies sharing one road would create traffic jams, confusion, and supply bottlenecks. Better to give the main highway to one force and have the other use secondary routes. It sounded logical in a briefing room, but the real reason, as Patton saw it, was pride and control. Montgomery wanted the main road because the main road led to Messina. Whoever controlled Route 124 controlled the direct path to victory, and Montgomery wasn't going to share that path, or the resulting glory, with Americans. Alexander approved the change. He trusted Montgomery's judgment implicitly and believed British forces should have priority for the decisive advance. The Americans could manage with what was left. This decision had immediate, visceral consequences. It forced Patton's 45th Division to countermarch all the way back to the coast to find a new path. Troops who had already fought their way inland, sweating and bleeding for every mile, had to turn around and march back, exhausting them before they could even start their assigned mission. They walked back through their own dust, demoralized, simply because they were in the way. It wasn't just a logistics decision. It was a personal insult to every American soldier who'd landed on that beach. When Patton learned that Route 124 was now exclusively British, he was apoplectic. This wasn't operational necessity. This was Montgomery ensuring the British got the credit for capturing Sicily, while the Americans were relegated to the hills. Patton studied his new assignment with a simmering rage. Protect Montgomery's flank, use secondary roads, stay out of the way. His staff officers prepared plans for the supporting mission. Position forces to guard against German counterattacks from the west, advance slowly behind British progress, and contribute quietly to Montgomery's success. But Patton looked at the map and saw something his staff didn't. He saw a void. If the Americans couldn't use the eastern road, they would take the western road. And if they moved fast enough, faster than doctrine said was possible, they could reach Messina before Montgomery even got close. It wasn't in the plan. It wasn't authorized. It would create massive friction with Montgomery and Alexander. Patton didn't care. The British had just stolen the main highway, to ensure American forces stayed in supporting roles. He was going to prove that American speed, aggression, and audacity could beat British caution, even without the best roads. July 10th, 1943. D-Day for Operation Husky. The Mediterranean erupted as Allied forces landed on Sicily's southern coast. British and Canadian forces under Montgomery hit the southeastern beaches, while American forces under Patton landed to the west at Gela and Licata. The landings were successful, but they were anything but easy. Rough seas and high winds scattered the airborne drops, spreading paratroopers all over the island, creating chaos that ironically confused the German defenders. Within 24 hours, despite the gale-force winds and the heavy surf, both armies had established beachheads and begun advancing inland. Montgomery's 8th Army pushed north along Route 114 toward their first objectives. Syracuse fell on July 11th. Augusta fell on July 13th. British forces were making steady, methodical progress up the eastern coast. Meanwhile, Patton's 7th Army secured the landing areas and turned west to accomplish their assigned mission: protect the flank. American soldiers sat in defensive positions, digging foxholes in the rocky soil, watching the smoke rise from the British sector. They had successfully completed the D-Day landings. They had defeated fierce Italian and German counterattacks, including a dangerous panzer assault at Gela. They were ready to drive into the island's interior. And yet, their orders were to guard the flank. Wait for Montgomery. Support the British. By July 14th, the pattern of the campaign was clear. Montgomery advanced slowly up the coast. Whenever his forces encountered significant resistance, they stopped. They stopped to bring up artillery, to reorganize, to build up overwhelming force before attacking again. This was Montgomery's doctrine. Never take unnecessary risks. Always ensure you have crushing superiority. However, this approach had a fatal flaw in the mountainous terrain of Sicily. It gave the Germans time. Every day Montgomery spent preparing for his next attack was a day German engineers spent mining bridges, positioning anti-tank guns, and building fortifications in the rugged lava fields of Mount Etna. While Montgomery advanced cautiously, Patton's much larger 7th Army sat idle, guarding against threats that weren't materializing. The western part of Sicily had minimal German presence. There was nothing substantial to defend against. The inactivity was corrosive. Soldiers want to fight, or they want to go home. They do not want to sit in a foxhole under the Sicilian sun waiting for someone else to win the war. Patton went to Alexander with a bold proposal. His forces were doing nothing useful, sitting on the flank. What if he took the western half of Sicily instead? The plan was to drive to Palermo, capture the western ports, then turn east and advance toward Messina from the west. Alexander was hesitant. That wasn't the plan. Montgomery had the main mission. Patton was supposed to support, not launch independent operations that might divert supplies. But Alexander could see the same reality Patton saw. The 7th Army was wasting time and resources sitting idle. At least Patton's proposal would accomplish something tangible. Alexander gave vague authorization. Patton could conduct a reconnaissance in force to the west. If opportunities presented themselves, he could exploit them. It was ambiguous permission political speak. It was not quite approval for a major offensive, but not a strict prohibition either. Patton took it as a green light, and when Alexander, perhaps realizing the scale of what Patton intended, later sent an order to halt the drive on Palermo, Patton's chief of staff, Hobart Gay, famously claimed the radio message arrived garbled and requested retransmission. The clarification conveniently didn't arrive until Patton had already entered the city. Patton wasn't just disobeying orders, he was weaponizing a radio malfunction to save American pride and seize the initiative. July 19th, 1943. Patton unleashed the American 7th Army in one of the most spectacular advances of the war. His objective? Palermo, Sicily's capital on the northwestern coast. The distance was over 100 miles through mountainous, treacherous terrain. Montgomery's staff had estimated it would take weeks to cover that distance. The roads were terrible, narrow, winding tracks, suitable for donkeys, not Sherman tanks. The mountains were a defensive nightmare. Any competent commander would advance cautiously. Patton gave his division commanders 72 hours. The 3rd Infantry Division under Major General Lucian Truscott led the advance, with the 2nd Armored Division and elements of the 82nd Airborne following. They moved day and night. When roads became impassable, engineers blasted new routes out of the cliffside. When resistance appeared, tanks bypassed it and kept moving, leaving the mopping up for the infantry behind. Truscott had trained his division in high-speed marching, a pace that became known as the Truscott Trot. It was a punishing pace. 5 miles per hour for short bursts, instead of the standard infantry pace of 2.5 miles per hour. This was how they covered 100 miles of mountains so quickly. This wasn't a march. It was a 100-mile lunge through a furnace. Patton drove his men to the breaking point because they all knew one thing: bleeding in the mountains was better than sitting on a British flank. The psychological impact on the enemy was devastating. Italian defenders were shocked by the speed and aggression. American columns appeared where they weren't supposed to be. At times they weren't expected. Towns that expected days of warning suddenly found American tanks in their piazzas. Entire garrisons surrendered without firing a shot because they couldn't organize a defense against an enemy that arrived too quickly to be real. Patton drove forward with the lead elements, standing in his command car, dust coating his uniform. He pushed commanders to move faster. When officers said their men needed rest, he told them to rest in Palermo. When supply officers said the logistics couldn't support the pace, he told them to figure it out or be relieved. His soldiers responded to this aggressive leadership. They were finally being unleashed, finally being allowed to show what American forces could do when they weren't sitting on British flanks playing support. July 22nd, 1943. Just 72 hours after the advance began, lead elements of the 2nd Armored Division entered Palermo. The capital of Sicily had fallen to American forces. The numbers were stunning. Over 100 miles covered in 3 days through difficult terrain. Thousands of Italian prisoners captured. Massive quantities of supplies seized. And it had been accomplished while Montgomery was still grinding slowly up the eastern coast. The press went wild. American newspapers ran headlines about Patton's lightning drive to Palermo. The general who had cleaned up the mess at Kasserine Pass was now capturing cities faster than anyone thought possible. British newspapers were more restrained. They noted that Palermo wasn't strategically important to the German evacuation. Messina was the real objective. They argued Patton had conducted a flashy operation in a secondary theater while Montgomery fought the main battle. Montgomery sent messages to Alexander complaining that Patton was grandstanding. He claimed the Western campaign was a sideshow, diverting resources. The real fighting, he insisted, was happening on the eastern coast, where British forces faced serious German resistance. But everyone who understood military operations saw the truth. Patton had just demonstrated that American forces could move faster and strike harder than British doctrine allowed. He had covered more ground in 72 hours than Montgomery covered in 12 days, and he had done it without the best roads, without priority for supplies, and without the starring role in the operation. Montgomery's humiliation was compounded when Patton radioed his next objective. The 7th Army was turning east. They were heading for Messina, and they were going to get there first. While Patton was capturing Palermo in 72 hours, Montgomery's 8th Army had run into a wall, a problem named Catania. Catania sat astride the main highway north to Messina, nestled in the shadow of Mount Etna. It was heavily defended by German and Italian forces, who had used the time Montgomery spent preparing his advance to build strong defensive positions known as the Etna Line. Montgomery's plan was to punch through Catania with overwhelming force, then continue north. But the Germans weren't cooperating. Every British attack was beaten back with heavy casualties. The terrain favored the defender. The narrow corridor between the volcano and the sea was a killing zone. Montgomery tried flanking movements. He launched amphibious operations to land troops behind German lines. He brought up additional artillery and air support. Nothing worked quickly enough. The British were stuck. And every day they spent stuck at Catania was a day Patton's forces could use to advance east from Palermo. Montgomery's staff calculated that even with the setbacks, they would still reach Messina before the Americans. Patton had farther to travel along the northern coastal road, which was riddled with tunnels and bridges that were easily destroyed. He would have to fight through German forces retreating in front of Montgomery. The mathematics said the British would win the race. What the mathematics didn't account for was Patton's willingness to drive his troops beyond what doctrine said was physically possible. August 1st, 1943. Both armies were now driving toward the same objective from different directions. Montgomery approaching from the south along Route 114. Patton, approaching from the west along Sicily's northern coast. This wasn't officially a race. Alexander's headquarters insisted both armies were conducting coordinated operations to trap German forces on the island, but everyone from private to general knew the truth. Whoever entered Messina first would claim victory. Whoever arrived second would spend the rest of the war remembering this moment. Montgomery pushed his exhausted troops harder than his doctrine normally allowed. He launched new attacks against the German defenses at Catania. He tried to bypass the city to the west, but the German defenders held firm. They knew holding Catania was the key to allowing their forces to evacuate to the Italian mainland. Patton pushed his troops even harder. The American 7th Army advanced along the narrow coastal road. It was a nightmare of engineering. When the Germans blew bridges, and they blew nearly all of them, American engineers built new ones under fire. When the Germans laid minefields, American infantry cleared them by hand. The terrain was brutal. Steep cliffs dropped directly into the sea. The road was often just a shelf cut into the rock. One destroyed bridge could stop an entire army. Patton didn't let anything stop his army. He realized that frontal assaults on these narrow roads were suicide. He needed to use the sea. He ordered a series of amphibious end runs, landing troops behind German lines to force them to retreat. It was risky. It was aggressive. It was exactly what Montgomery wouldn't do without weeks of planning. And it worked. The Germans couldn't set up stable defensive lines because the Americans kept appearing behind them. By August 15th, Patton's forces were within striking distance of Messina. Montgomery had finally broken through at Catania, but he was still miles behind. The British 8th Army was advancing, but they were advancing at Montgomery's pace. The American 7th Army was advancing at Patton's pace. August 8th. Montgomery's forces were 40 miles from Messina. Patton's forces were 50 miles away. The British had the shorter distance, better roads, and the advantage of attacking along the main highway. But Patton had momentum. His forces were moving faster than British forces, even with the worst roads. He was gaining ground every day. Montgomery sent a message to Alexander complaining about coordination with American forces. He suggested that having both armies racing for the same objective created unnecessary confusion. Perhaps the Americans should halt and let the British finish the operation. Alexander knew what Montgomery was really saying. He was afraid Patton would beat him to Messina and wanted authorization to make the Americans stop. Alexander refused. Both armies would continue operations. The first army to reach Messina would secure the city. The race was on. Patton was running out of time. His forces were still 35 miles from Messina. Montgomery's forces were only 25 miles away. The British were closing in faster than the Americans. Patton looked at the map and saw an opportunity. Sicily's northern coast had beaches all along the route to Messina. What if he used the Navy to leapfrog troops behind German defensive positions? He ordered his staff to organize 3 amphibious operations, land troops ahead of the current front lines, force the Germans to retreat or be surrounded. His staff officers protested. They didn't have enough landing craft. The Navy wasn't prepared for improvised amphibious assaults. The coordination with ground forces would be nightmarish. Patton told them to make it work. August 8th, the first landing at Sant'Agata. American troops came ashore behind German lines. The Germans retreated to avoid encirclement. It was a textbook maneuver. August 11th. The second landing at Brolo. This one nearly became a disaster. The 2nd Battalion, 30th Infantry, was almost cut off and annihilated. They landed, but the German forces were stronger than expected and counterattacked viciously before the main American advance could link up. The battalion fought desperately, surrounded, running low on ammunition, until relieved by the main force. It was a near-run thing, a gamble that almost cost a battalion, but it kept the momentum moving. August 16th, the final landing at Spadafora, unopposed. The Germans were already evacuating. Patton had leapfrogged his way up the coast through aggressive gambles that nearly backfired, but they worked. Montgomery heard about Patton's amphibious operations and was furious. This was exactly the kind of reckless risk-taking that professional soldiers avoided. Patton was gambling with his troops' lives to win a publicity race. But Montgomery also recognized what was happening. Patton was going to reach Messina first, unless the British moved faster. August 14th. Montgomery launched his own amphibious operation. British troops landed near Scaletta, 12 miles south of Messina. The British were now racing against Patton using his own tactics. But it was too late. Patton's forces were already closer. and they were moving faster than exhausted British troops could match. August 16th. American forces were 3 miles from Messina. British forces were 15 miles away. The mathematics were clear. Barring disaster, the Americans would enter the city first. Patton radioed his lead division with explicit orders. Get to Messina tomorrow. He didn't care how tired they were. He didn't care what resistance they faced. Tomorrow morning, American soldiers would be in Messina before the British arrived. On the evening of August 16th, lead elements of the 3rd Infantry Division reached the outskirts of Messina. They paused for the night to organize for the final entry. Patton sent a message to Truscott: go in and take the city. Don't wait for the British. August 17th, 1943. At 6:30 a.m., a patrol from the 3rd Battalion, 15th Infantry Regiment entered Messina. They met no resistance. The Germans had evacuated across the strait to Italy during the night. The Americans drove to the city hall. They drove to the port. They raised the American flag. At 10:30 a.m., a British column from the 8th Army rolled into the city from the south. The British commander, a brigadier, dismounted his vehicle and prepared to accept the city's surrender. He was greeted by an American lieutenant colonel who asked him what took him so long. Patton arrived a few hours later. He drove into the city in his command car, sirens wailing, dust trailing behind him like a conqueror's cape. He went to the city hall where the American flag was already flying. He shook hands with the British brigadier. It was a jolly good race, the Brit said, attempting to maintain dignity. I think you won. Patton smiled. He knew he had won. But more importantly, he knew what the victory meant. It wasn't just about Messina. It wasn't just about beating Montgomery. It was about the United States Army. In 38 days of fighting, the American soldier had proven himself. He had landed on hostile shores. He had defeated enemy counterattacks. He had marched across mountains that were supposed to be impassable. He had captured cities that were supposed to be out of reach. He had done it faster than the British. He had done it better than the British. And he had done it while the British High Command tried to keep him on the sidelines. The race to Messina ended the myth of British military superiority. It ended the idea that Americans were junior partners who needed British supervision. From that moment on, the United States was the driving force of the alliance. When the Allies landed in France the following year, an American would be supreme commander. The main effort would be American. The victory would be American. And it all started on a dusty road in Sicily, where George S. Patton decided he wasn't going to let anyone park his army on the sidelines. The British wanted protection. Patton gave them a masterclass in warfare. And when the smoke cleared, the amateurs were the ones holding the keys to the city. German commanders drew their own lessons from the debacle. They described Patton as dangerously unpredictable and aggressive. They characterized Montgomery as cautious and methodical, to the point of being easy to defend against. One German report captured it perfectly. Patton is the most dangerous Allied commander in the theater. His forces move faster and hit harder than any others. General Hans Valentin Hube, who commanded German forces in Sicily, was blunt in his assessment. Montgomery was predictable. Patton was dangerous. Hube described Montgomery's pattern: build up overwhelming force, conduct methodical attacks, consolidate after each advance. It made Montgomery easy to defend against, because German commanders knew what was coming. They could prepare positions, time their retreats, and keep British forces contained. Patton was different. German intelligence couldn't predict his moves. He attacked when doctrine said forces should rest. He bypassed strong positions instead of reducing them methodically. He launched operations with inadequate supplies and made them work anyway. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who commanded all German forces in Italy, reached the same conclusion. British forces under Montgomery were professionally competent, but lacked boldness. American forces under Patton were aggressive to the point of recklessness and far more difficult to contain. General Fridolin von Senger und Etterlin, who would later defend Cassino, captured the difference perfectly. Defending against Montgomery is a mathematical problem. Defending against Patton is a continuous emergency. The Germans respected Montgomery's mind, but they feared Patton's soul. This assessment reached Allied intelligence. Eisenhower and other senior commanders saw what German generals thought of their subordinates. It vindicated everything Patton had argued about aggressive tactics. The Germans themselves confirmed that speed and audacity created more problems for the enemy than methodical caution. Montgomery's response to losing the race was revealing. He claimed it had never been a race. The operation was coordinated. Both armies had accomplished their objectives. He argued that his forces had faced stronger German resistance, which was true, and that the eastern route had more enemy divisions. But he also insisted the timeline had always been flexible. Reaching Messina on August 17th was perfectly acceptable, he argued, even if the Americans arrived a few hours earlier. Montgomery looked at the same maps as everyone else, but refused to see the same reality. He started positioning the Sicily campaign as a strategic success that proved his operational methods. The more Montgomery talked, the more it became clear he was making excuses. Professional soldiers don't need to explain away victories. Montgomery's defensive explanations told everyone he knew he had lost. Behind closed doors, Montgomery complained to his staff about Patton's grandstanding, about American commanders who cared more about publicity than proper military operations, about how the race to Messina had caused unnecessary casualties. His chief of staff had to remind him that despite the longer route, Patton's 7th Army suffered roughly 10,000 total casualties compared to the 12,800 sustained by the British 8th. The American advance had been more efficient by every metric that mattered, and George Patton had just made him look second-rate in front of the entire Allied command. The feud that would poison Anglo-American operations for the rest of the war had truly begun. The Sicily campaign created a permanent rift between Patton and Montgomery. What started as professional rivalry became personal hatred. Montgomery never forgave Patton for beating him to Messina. In his mind, the American general had grandstanded and taken unnecessary risks to steal glory that rightfully belonged to British forces. Patton's 72-hour drive to Palermo was reckless showboating. The race to Messina was undisciplined competition that compromised operational security. Montgomery's post-war memoirs described Sicily as a successful operation where British forces defeated the main German resistance while Americans handled secondary objectives. He mentioned Patton's arrival in Messina as an afterthought, not as a defeat. Patton never forgave Montgomery for trying to sideline American forces. In his view, Montgomery had stolen Route 124 to ensure Americans played supporting roles while British forces claimed credit. Montgomery's careful planning was just cowardice disguised as professionalism. His post-battle excuses proved he knew he had lost. Patton's diary entries from Sicily reveal his contempt. He wrote that Montgomery was overly cautious, and that the race to Messina proved American arms were superior. He characterized British tactics as slow and ineffective compared to American aggression. The feud poisoned Anglo-American cooperation for the rest of the war. In Normandy, during the Battle of the Bulge, during the drive into Germany, Patton and Montgomery competed instead of cooperating. Their staffs fought over supplies, logistics, and operational priorities. The numbers didn't lie. Aggressive American tactics produced faster victories at lower cost than cautious British professionalism. And every time Montgomery and Patton worked together after Sicily, both men remembered who got to Messina first. Sicily changed everything. Without that 72-hour drive to Palermo, Patton never commands Third Army in France. Without beating Montgomery to Messina, American forces stay in supporting roles, perhaps for the duration of the war. The race to Messina was when the United States proved it was no longer Britain's junior partner, not in industrial capacity, not in manpower, in military competence. But the race came at a cost. While Patton and Montgomery competed for the city, the Germans executed Operation Lehrgang. They evacuated 101,000 men and 10,000 vehicles across the Strait of Messina to mainland Italy. The Allies were looking at each other instead of closing the trap. While the two titans were glaring at each other, the enemy slipped through the back door. It was a victory for the headlines, but a missed opportunity for the history books. Still, what Sicily proved mattered more than what it cost. Patton's aggressive tactics, Montgomery's cautious excuses, German commanders drawing explicit conclusions about which general was dangerous, and George Patton was the general who proved it to the world. The British wanted protection. Patton gave them a masterclass in warfare, and when the smoke cleared, the amateurs were the ones holding the keys to the city.